Today's scripture reading brings us to Acts chapter 23, just one chapter today, and it's pretty straightforward, but I have a couple things I do want to share with you. Now, to get chapter 23, it's best, of course, if you make sure and understand chapters 21 and 22 because they lead right into chapter 23. I only have this chapter broken down in two sections broadly. Verses 1 through 11, I did have that titled Paul Before the Jewish Council, but then I went back and I added something and I changed it to Paul Causes a Stink Before the Jewish Council, because that's what Paul did. He begins simply trying to speak unto them. It was Paul's desire that they be saved, right? So it says he earnestly beheld the council. He didn't get one sentence out. The high priest commanded someone to hit him. Paul then calls him a whited wall, essentially calls him a hypocrite. When Paul saw that he was not going to have liberty to speak unto them, he caused a stink. He employed what Jesus advised his apostles in Matthew 10:16, was essentially wise as a serpent but harmless as a dove. Rather than having this great group of Sadducees and Pharisees against him, he spoke out and said, I'm a Pharisee, and it's because I believe in the resurrection of the dead that I'm brought here before you. The Sadducees didn't believe in the resurrection. The Pharisees did. And so, therefore, instead of them all being against him, they kind of turned one upon another. It's very wise that he did that, obviously. There is one verse that I do want to mention that we can glean a lot from and get some good stuff from, and that's found in verse number 11. After he is tried and after he is brought back into the castle when, this big stink happens and uproar, Paul is, the day before he was beat half to death. In the night following that, of course, the next day after this had happened, it says, in the night following, the Lord stood by him and said, Be of good cheer, Paul, for as thou hast testified of me in Jerusalem, so must thou bear witness also in Rome. And from this, we see a few things. Number one, Jesus was there. Man, it's so good, even in our troublous times, that Jesus is there. Jesus was there for Paul. Secondly, he had a plan. Paul could have joy. Paul could have joy because Jesus was there and Jesus had a plan. And it didn't matter if they were a Sadducee, a Pharisee, a scribe. None of them could thwart God's plan. And they tried to kill him later on in this chapter, but they couldn't. Why? Because God had a plan for Paul and his life. So it leads us to the remaining verses of this chapter, verses 12 through 35. And I have that titled, The Jews' Plot to Kill Paul is Thwarted. So there's 40 of them. They took a hunger vow that they weren't going to eat until they killed Paul. Well, they wouldn't kill Paul, and he wouldn't die for a couple years later, at least. So they either starved to death or they broke their vow, one of the two. They vowed that they were going to kill him. Paul's sister's son overheard this vow. He went unto the chief captain, informed him of this, and it was the chief captain's best discernment that the way to handle this would be to take Paul by night under armed guard and get him out of the city. Send him unto the governor in Caesarea, and he wrote the governor a letter. You can find that between verses 26 and 30, kind of explaining the situation. Paul gets to Caesarea, he gets unto Felix. Felix reads the letter, and he puts Paul in holding in Herod's judgment hall until his accusers are informed of what has happened, and they are brought to accuse him before Felix, and he would oversee the matter. I do want to say this, that I do believe the Bible when it says all things work to good of them that love God and called according to his purpose. Now, in the last two chapters, we saw that Paul was out of the will of God. We see that very clearly when God warned him through the Spirit in chapter 21 not to go to Jerusalem. He warned him in Tyre. He warned him in, where was it? Caesarea. Warned him not to go, but he went anyway. Yet, God still used Paul, and God still used Paul to accomplish his purpose. Paul messed up, but that just makes him human, like you and like me. We mess up. We fall short. But God can still take our mess and turn it into a message, right? I hate using those cliche lines, but it's true. He can. God was going to use Paul one way or the other. And he may have used him differently. Paul may have ended up having to sit in prison for 3 years, however long it was, in order to write the epistles. But God still used him. He still used him. Paul went to Rome, and he testified in Rome. And it was in those Roman prisons where he wrote those prison epistles, to which we use for church doctrine to this very day. So, the important thing is not if you mess up. We'll all mess up. The important thing is that we continue on and still allow God to use us, because God will. He did for Paul, and he certainly has for me, and he will for you if you let him. That being said, that's going to do it for today's scripture reading. Lord willing, we'll see you tomorrow.